It began with the sound of something breaking. Not glass, not wood, something softer, something alive. In the hollow beneath Black Hollow Ridge, where fog clings to the trees like the memory of breath, a woman screamed into the dark, and the mountains swallowed it whole. They said no echo ever returned from that place, only the smell of blood, smoke, and wet earth. By the time the neighbors came, if they could be called neighbors at all, they found the cabin door open, swinging in the wind. The floorboards were slick with something blackened and half dried, and in the corner lay the birth cloth, stiff with what the midwife refused to name. The woman was there, bare feet in the dirt, her hair matted with sweat and soil. In her arms, a child that did not cry. She held it close as if to hush it, but there was no sound to hush, only the wet, uneven rasp of her breathing. They said the baby had eyes like creek water after a storm, murky, shifting, too pale for the light. They said it looked like the brother, but no one asked. You didn't ask questions in that valley. Questions had a way of circling back to you, heavier than when they left. Outside, a thin mist rose from the ground, carrying with it the scent of pine and something else, something rotting. The mother didn't look at them when they spoke her name. She just kept rocking, whispering something that might have been a lullaby or might have been a prayer. The old women crossed themselves and left bread on the porch. The men stared at the tree line, pretending not to see the man watching from the ridge. The brother, the father, the shadow with their blood in his veins. That night, the mountains went silent. Even the crickets stopped, and for years after, no one went near that cabin unless they had to, because in those hills, birth was not always a beginning. Sometimes, it was an omen. Which city are you watching from, and what time is it right now? If you trace your finger across an old map of eastern Kentucky, one yellowed by time, the kind they keep folded in courthouse drawers, you'll see a cluster of ridges that were never meant to hold names. Just a scatter of lines, like veins drawn by a trembling hand. That's where she lived, somewhere between Pine Ridge and the forgotten bends of Troublesome Creek, a place so far from the main road that even the county lines gave up trying to claim it. The land there is heavy. You can feel it when you breathe. The air sits too still, the trees too close together, as though the forest itself doesn't trust outsiders to walk through it. People say that's where time stops, not because clocks don't work, but because no one needs them. You wake with the sun and sleep when it leaves, and in between, you just survive. In the early 1900s, families settled in those valleys and never came out. They built cabins from whatever the forest gave them, planted what little would grow in the thin soil, and raised their children with hands cracked by frost. They had no churches for miles, no schools, no doctors. Their bloodlines tangled like the vines that climbed their porches. It wasn't malice, it wasn't madness. It was distance, the kind that makes the world shrink until only your own kind remains. She was born there. No one wrote down the year. Her birth, like most in that valley, was marked only by the memory of her mother's screams and the flicker of a kerosene lamp against a dirt wall. They say she was quiet even as a baby, didn't cry much, didn't laugh either, just watched, always watching, with those same creek, water eyes that her children would later inherit. When she was 12, her father's lungs failed from the mines. By 16, she was the only girl left in a house full of men. Her brother, older by 5 years, took over what was left of the farm, if you could call it that. And as the seasons turned, something between them began to shift. The valley had a way of making love and need look the same. Outsiders like to imagine evil comes with thunder, with shouts, with clear lines between right and wrong. But in places like that, evil seeps in quietly. It looks like hunger, like kindness left unchecked. And by the time anyone realizes what it's become, it's already too late. They say one winter night, when the snow pressed against the cabin walls and the world went white and still, the brother didn't leave her room. And by spring, the valley knew, though no one dared to speak. When the first child came, the midwife never looked her in the eye. She brought her hands, her boiling water, and her silence. Outside, the brother paced beneath the dripping eaves, his boots sinking into the thawing mud. When the cry finally came, a small, strained sound that barely filled the cabin, it didn't sound human. It was thin, like a reed whistling in the wind. The midwife left before dawn. She told no one what she'd seen, but word travels differently in the mountains. It doesn't move fast, but it never dies. The people down in the nearest town, the ones who came once a month with flour and salt, started talking. They said the baby had strange eyes, too light, too knowing. That its hands were curled in a way that made your stomach twist when you saw them. But they didn't stop trading. They needed the brother's timber, and he needed their goods. So they kept their distance and their silence. The child grew, if you could call it that. By 3 it still couldn't walk right. Its legs bowed inward. Its words slurred like someone speaking through water. Yet sometimes, when the mother sat on the porch in the dying light, the child would hum, a low, rhythmic tune that no one had taught it, the same one she whispered on the night of its birth. By the time the second child came, no one visited the cabin anymore. Even the mail carrier left letters at the edge of the road, weighed down by a stone. The woods had grown thick around the property, as if trying to swallow it whole. The brother built new walls, new rooms, each one darker than the last, and in those rooms the children grew, pale, watchful, and quiet. Their laughter, when it came, was thin and broken. Their eyes didn't blink enough. One boy collected bones from the forest and arranged them by size. Another drew shapes into the dirt that the mother didn't recognize. Circles, crosses, loops that seemed to mean something. By the fourth child, no one remembered her name. She was just the woman up the ridge, the one whose children didn't speak right, the one whose brother never left the farm. And when the fifth was born, even the midwife refused to come. The woman cut the cord herself, washed the blood from the floor, and rocked the baby until her arms went numb. No one in the valley saw her for months after that. Smoke rose from the chimney some days, none on others. The forest began to reclaim the path to her door, but those who passed nearby swore they heard singing from within, a thin, cracked voice, and others joining it, off key and hollow, like echoes of something that should never have been taught. By the time the children reached their teenage years, the valley had all but forgotten them. Or maybe it chose to. The mountain folk have a way of letting rot grow quiet, turning their heads, pretending the stench is only rain-soaked wood. But some things won't stay buried. The sound of them began to spread. At night, hunters would pause mid-step, arrows half drawn, when they heard laughter echoing through the trees. Not the laughter of joy, but the kind that doesn't seem to come from a throat. Some said it was the wind. Others said it wasn't. Dogs refused to go near that stretch of forest, howling and trembling at the tree line, until their owners dragged them home. Those who caught glimpses spoke of faces, too pale, too still, peering from behind the windows of the cabin. 5 children. though it was said one rarely moved. Sometimes you could see the glow of lamplight through the cracks, shapes shifting slowly inside, like a play with no sound. The mother's body had changed. Her back bent early, her hair silvered too soon. She walked like someone carrying more than weight, like guilt had settled into her bones. And yet, she loved them. You could see it in the way she touched their faces, tracing each malformed jaw, each uneven brow, with hands that shook but never pulled away. But love can twist just as easily as blood. The brother drank more each year, his voice growing harder, his eyes hollow. He worked the same patch of dead soil and called it survival. When people asked why he didn't take a wife, he'd only smile, showing teeth worn thin. By then, no one dared ask twice. There were other whispers too, that he'd begun keeping a book, not of words, but of marks, strange lines, carved deep into the wooden walls of the cabin, circles within circles. Some said it was the children who made them, not the father. That they did it while the mother slept, humming the same tune their mother had once used to calm them. In spring of 1943, a preacher came to the valley, sent by a mission from Lexington. He was young, hopeful, full of the kind of faith that hadn't yet met the real world. They say he tried to visit the cabin on the ridge. He knocked once, twice, 3 times. The door never opened, but the singing stopped. He left before sundown, pale and trembling, and when they asked what he'd seen, he said only one thing before leaving for good: "There are no children up there, only mouths that remember how to sound like them." After the preacher fled, no one dared to go back up the ridge. Whatever lived in that cabin was left to itself. Seasons passed without a trace. Some winters brought smoke from the chimney, others none at all. Those who lived closest swore they heard things on still nights. Soft thuds against wood, muffled cries that rose and fell like the wind through hollow pipes. But the mountains kept their secrets. They always had. By 1950, the brother's name appeared once in a county ledger. Nothing more than a purchase of salt, nails, and lamp oil. The clerk wrote beside it, paid in silence. No one saw him again, whether he died or vanished, or simply became part of the hills. No one knew. What they did know was that the woman remained. A hunter passing through that winter claimed he saw her through the trees, standing barefoot in the snow, her nightdress clinging to her thin frame. Behind her, faint outlines of smaller figures moved. 5 of them, silent, swaying, their faces pale in the moonlight. He didn't stay to look closer. He said her head turned too far when she watched him go. By then, the children had become something else. The older 2 rarely left the cabin, their movements stiff and jerking. One had a neck that leaned sharply to the side, another, a mouth that didn't close fully, always hanging open as though mid-word. The youngest, a girl, was said to be the most normal, though even that word lost its meaning in those hills. She had her mother's eyes and her father's silence. They said she spoke to the forest. She'd vanish for hours and come back with her hands covered in dirt, carrying small, broken things. Bird bones, rabbit skulls, the teeth of something larger. She'd lay them out on the porch, arranging them into spirals that looked like the carvings inside the house. And every night, the mother would sweep them away, whispering, "Not again, child, not again." But the next morning they'd return, perfectly remade, as if the wind itself remembered their shape. Sometimes, when the fog rolled down from the ridge, the valley folks said they could hear the mother singing again, though her voice was weaker now, worn thin by years of smoke and sorrow. But behind her voice were others, higher, uneven, and out of time. like echoes that didn't belong to this world. It was around then that people began to say the mountain wasn't just keeping them, it was feeding on them. That the soil beneath the cabin drank their lineage, their shame, their very names. And in return, it gave them silence. The winter of 1954 was the coldest the valley had seen in half a century. The river froze at its edges, and the trees cracked at night like gunfire. Most families burned through every stick of wood they had, huddled inside with prayers that didn't reach past their roofs. But up on the ridge, no one saw smoke from the old cabin for months. The path that led there had vanished under snow and fallen branches, and the forest seemed almost relieved. Then, one morning in early March, a trapper came down from the northern slope, shaking, his eyes glassy, as though he'd seen something that refused to let him go. He said he'd found the cabin, or what was left of it. The roof had collapsed inward, and the door hung crooked from its hinges. Inside, there were signs of life, but not the kind that belongs to the living. He spoke of bones arranged neatly by the hearth, as though someone had been counting them. 5 small piles, each crowned by a lock of hair, and on the far wall, burned into the boards, a symbol, concentric rings of ash, still faintly warm to the touch. He didn't stay long enough to find the mother. He claimed he heard humming from beneath the floorboards, a low, wet sound like a breath caught between sobs. When he told his story in town, the sheriff nodded, but he didn't go. No one did. The ridge was declared cursed ground. The church called it God's justice. The elders called it nature taking back what was owed. Either way, the path to that place was left to rot, swallowed by vines and the silence that grows thicker than snow. Years turned to decades. The cabin fell into itself, boards blackened and soft. But people still spoke of it, quietly, and only when the wind howled down the valley in a way that made windows tremble. They said sometimes, under the right moon, you could see figures near the ruins, children still small moving in the dark. In 1979, a pair of university researchers came through from Louisville, collecting stories about Appalachian folklore. They laughed when the locals warned them off the ridge. They said superstition was just history misremembered. One of them went up alone. He came back at dawn with his notebook half torn, his hands covered in dirt, muttering that the carvings were still there, that someone had been adding to them. Circles inside circles, as if the story was still being written, even after everyone had gone. He left the valley the next day and never returned. The other researcher packed their things in silence. When asked what happened, she said only, he wouldn't stop humming. By the time the 80s came, the valley had changed. Asphalt roads cut through what used to be deer trails, and electric lines hummed where owls once perched. But the ridge never changed. Locals still refused to hunt near it. Surveyors' maps left that section blank, labeling it unstable terrain. It wasn't until 1986 that the silence broke again. A crew clearing land for a new power line unearthed something just beyond the tree line, a shallow pit, maybe 2 feet deep, filled with what they thought was scrap wood. But it wasn't wood. It was bone, blackened and fused together, as if burned long ago, but never buried right. The county coroner tried to identify them, but time had erased every trace. He said only one thing was certain. Some of the bones were too small to belong to adults, and mixed among them were tiny carvings, circles cut into the surface of the femurs, repeated over and over like a language no one had written for centuries. After that, strange things began happening again. Radio signals warped when passing near the ridge. Compasses spun. Hunters who wandered too close said their dogs went quiet, then bolted, tails between their legs, whining like something unseen had pressed against them. A hiker who camped there in '88 claimed he heard singing just before dawn, low and rhythmic, with voices that never quite matched in time. He followed the sound until he reached what remained of the cabin, a skeleton of timbers crawling with moss. But when he stepped closer, he swore the moss shifted, as if breathing. He didn't go further. He just watched. Because through the fog, faint outlines appeared in the doorway. Small figures, motionless, heads tilted toward him. Then one of them raised a hand, not to wave, not to call, but to hush. He ran. When he told the story, his voice cracked. He said their eyes didn't glow or move, but he could feel them watching through the dark, as if seeing wasn't necessary, as if they knew him before he even came. After that, locals started calling the ridge Mother's Hollow. No one built there, no one logged it. Even the government surveyors marked it as protected land, though no one ever said why. But those who lived nearby, those who'd grown up hearing the stories, knew the truth, that the woman and her 5 children never truly died. They'd been claimed by the mountain. And sometimes, when the fog descends and the trees go still, you can still hear her song carrying down the slopes, soft, broken, and full of names that no one living remembers anymore. By the early 2000s, Mother's Hollow had become a name whispered more than spoken. Teenagers dared each other to drive up the old service road, but most turned back before reaching the tree line. They said the air changed there, too thick, too heavy, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. Then came the flood of 2003. Days of unbroken rain tore through the valley, pulling down trees and washing away the old roads. When the waters receded, something new was uncovered. An opening in the hillside where the cabin once stood, half collapsed and slick with mud. It wasn't a cave exactly, more like a hollowed space carved by hands that didn't know rest. Inside, the rescue crews found remnants, a rusted lantern, a set of bones smaller than a man's hand, and the shape of something drawn into the clay walls. Circles, again, hundreds of them, some intersecting, some broken. At the very center of the chamber was a single child's shoe, untouched by the flood. The sheriff sealed the site within the week, citing safety concerns. But word leaked out. Old-timers said the flood hadn't destroyed the hollow, it had fed it. That the mountain had opened its mouth again, taking back what belonged to it. After that, the valley changed in quiet ways. Livestock began to vanish. Birds avoided the trees near the ridge. The wind itself seemed wrong, shifting in patterns that didn't belong to the weather. One family who lived nearest the woods claimed they heard knocking from the trees every night for weeks. Slow, patient, like someone asking to be let in. And then there was the girl. In 2005, a young woman appeared at a gas station 10 miles from the ridge. Barefoot, mud up to her knees. No memory of where she came from. She gave a name no one recognized, one that matched nothing in county records, not even in the old birth registries. When the deputy asked where she lived, she only said, the singing stopped. That she was taken in by the state, but she never stayed long in one place. Foster families said she spoke softly in her sleep, murmuring in a language that wasn't English. One described it as circles made into sound. When they tried to record her, the tape hissed, warped, and erased itself, every time, the last anyone saw of her. She was walking north along the railroad tracks that cut through the valley, toward the ridge, toward the place that no map dared to mark anymore. Some say she was the last of them, the youngest child of the mother who loved too deeply and too wrong. Others say she was something else entirely, a voice the mountain had made for itself. And sometimes, when the fog rolls down and the river hums low, people still swear they hear her singing, 5 notes at a time, always ending in silence. By the time the 21st century found its way to the valley, Mother's Hollow had become nothing more than a rumor pressed into the soil. The world had moved on. New roads, cell towers, bright lights that bled the stars from the sky. But in that corner of Kentucky, where the mist still rises thicker than prayer, the old rules never stopped breathing. In the fall of 2018, a pair of urban explorers came through, young, curious, hungry for something real. They'd read the legends online, watched the grainy videos, seen the maps with the circle of trees marked in red. They wanted proof. They wanted content. The camera they carried was found 3 days later, washed downstream, half cracked but still holding charge. The sheriff's office released nothing to the public, but one deputy, drunk and shaking, told a bar full of miners what he'd seen. A frame of the cabin, still standing though no one had built it again. A woman's shape in the doorway, her face too blurred to belong to the lens, and behind her 5 shadows, each smaller than the last, their heads bowed like mourners. Then, the sound, not words, not cries, something between humming and breathing, drawn out, circular, endless. The kind of sound that feels alive long after it stops. The footage cut to black. After that, the sheriff sealed the area once more. The access road was buried under gravel and marked private land. Locals whispered that state men came up that night. Black trucks, no plates, equipment that hummed like the edge of thunder. Some said they dug something up. Others swore they buried something deeper. Whatever truth lay in those hills didn't come back down. But people started to notice the change again. A fog that lingered longer than it should. The sound of singing without a source. Circles of flattened grass appearing in perfect patterns after rain. And sometimes, only sometimes, footprints too small to belong to adults, leading up the ridge, never back down. Those who live nearest say they've seen her, a pale figure on the slope, her dress torn, her hair silver in the moonlight. Sometimes she's holding something. Sometimes she's humming. Always she's watching the valley, as though counting the years between her and the world that forgot her. And on nights when the wind falls silent and even the crickets stop, if you listen closely, you can still hear the melody that carried through generations of blood and shame. 5 soft notes, rising, circling, ending where they began. No one remembers her name now, only the ridge, only the hollow, and the story that still hums beneath the ground. The mother who bore her children into darkness and became the mountain that would never let them go.